The McAlvany Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. Well, you know, David, it's not just us that have been talking about the dangers of the banking system. You know, big names are starting to hit the news. This week, Alan Greenspan has been talking about fears of insolvency.
He observed that fears of insolvency, this was in the Financial Times yesterday, Kevin, fears of insolvency have not as yet been fully set aside. There may be a number of banks and other financial institutions that, at the edge of defaulting, will end up being bailed out by governments. And later he warned the danger is that some governments, bedeviled by emerging inflationary forces, will endeavor to reassert their grip on economic affairs. If that becomes widespread, globalization could reverse at awesome cost. Again, that's from the Financial Times yesterday. Kevin, again, this is a chorus of voices. Hiroshi Nakaso, he was a senior official at the Bank of Japan, has said this week that he has a sense of deja vu, saying that I see striking similarities in what I see today with the early stages of our own financial crisis in Japan more than a decade ago.
This is exactly what we've been talking about. Are we seeing a repeat of what happened to Japan? I mean, we saw Japan at the very top of its game. I remember when 1 square foot of Tokyo real estate at one point was $40,000 a square foot. And then, of course, we went through that, 10, 15, almost 15-year period where they've just disappeared from the map. What about Rubini? I mean, from the New York University Economist.
Yeah, Rubini said this last week. It's interesting, just to put this in context, Kevin, we've had 8 banking institutions so far this year that have gone bankrupt. 8. We had one more that went under this last week. And imagine, it only took 17% of the FDIC's total capital to cover the depositors of these banks. It took 17% for these 8 banks.
For 8 banks.
Rubini says we're now in the second inning of a severe, protracted recession, which started in the first quarter of this year and is going to last at least 18 months through the middle of next year. A systemic banking crisis will go on for a while, with hundreds of banks going belly up, end quote. So, Kevin, with 8,492 banks remaining, it should be comforting to know that the FDIC's remaining capital will cover exactly 1/3 of 1% of current or existing U.S. bank deposits.
Well, David, let's face it, like we talked about last week, if the FDIC runs out of money, is our government going to just step aside and not bail the rest of the banks out? Or are we just going to see more nationalization like we did with Bear Stearns?
Well, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, even though it is a private insurance company, will likely become federal in more than name.
So they'll probably drop the C off of the FDIC, which stands for corporation.
Correct. Rubini went on to say, and this is a good retrospective take Citigroup. In 1991, there was a small real estate bust, though the quarterly fall in home prices was only 4% based on the S&P Case-Shiller indices. Citi was effectively bankrupt, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Fed, and that allowed the government to give the bank regulatory forbearance. Citi was allowed to ride it out and try to recapitalize in a few years and thereby avoid bankruptcy protection. This time around, the S&P Case-Shiller indices indicate home prices have already fallen 18%, not 4, 18%. The decline could be as much as 30% because the excess supply is huge. So, Kevin, the banking troubles are continuing to unfold. Total write-down since the beginning of 2007. And if you have a pen, these are numbers worth noting. Total write-downs so far in the top U.S. financial firms. Bear Stearns stands at $3.2 billion in write-downs, followed by Goldman Sachs, $3.8 billion in write-downs. J.P. Morgan, $12.8 billion in write-downs. We're getting to larger numbers. Morgan Stanley, $14.4 billion in write-downs. Merrill Lynch, $51.8, including what we reported last week. Merrill Lynch is now at $51.8 billion in write-downs, and Citigroup has actually been the worst hit with $54.6 billion.
Well, I think we probably ought to remember, too, David, they're writing down what they know is going to start to hit the public eye. trying to get rid of it before it really brings them down. But, we talked a few months ago about these new FASB rules that are coming out that would expose everything, just actual accurate accounting, FASB 140. Now look what's happening.
Exactly, Kevin. FASB 140, which we mentioned a few weeks back, was basically a requirement that was supposed to go into effect January 2009, would take all of those off-balance sheet items, the things that, we found, unfortunately, in the case of Enron and WorldCom, where a lot of truth was obfuscated and a lot of corporate malfeasance and bad investments had been sort of just shuffled off into. Well, the banking system has been doing that, and it's been legitimate, it's been legal. Mm-hmm. The Federal Accounting Standards Board has said enough is enough. We've got to get punitive and got to get regulated, because this is really where a lot of the risk lies. This is fascinating, Kevin. This was supposed to take effect 2009, and it just got pushed back a year. Robert Hertz,
so it's like brushing it under the carpet. Hide it at least in the back room for a while.
The fascinating thing is that the chairman of the FASB, Robert Hertz, the tone, you should have heard the interview. His tone, he was angry that he had to make this decision. It does pain me, he says, it does pain me to allow something that has been abused by certain folks to let that go for another year. Mr. Hertz also noted that he was chagrined by what had been uncovered about these vehicles as the new rule was being prepared, noting that a combination of poor reporting and lax enforcement had led to the current situation. Now, he's angry because he's actually a regulator, okay? And he got a call. I don't know who called him, but he got a call which said this needs to go away for 12 months. And he's looking at this as a moral issue. He's looking at this as something that needs to be instituted, and now he's being told it has to wait at least 12 months more.
You know what it reminds me of? If this were in a corporate situation like Enron, where the accountants got a call from above, and they just basically said, look, you cannot give accurate accounting right now, so we want to see this disappear for the next year.
Right.
That's criminal.
There's no bones about that, Kevin. That's exactly what it is. So last but not least, as Stephen Roach's reflections, and as you mentioned earlier, Kevin, this is not just us reflecting on the troubled nature of the world economy. Stephen Roach, in a recent article titled Pitfalls in a Post-Bubble World, and I would encourage all of our clients to Google that, find it on the internet, and read it. He says, no economy can live beyond its means in perpetuity. Yet, like others that have tried to do so in the past, the U.S. thought it was different. Behind this outcome was the confluence of two monstrous bubbles, property and credit, that transformed residential dwellings into the functional equivalent of ATM machines. And of course, they went on a record debt binge to pull it off. Household sector indebtedness surged to 133% of disposable personal income by year-end 2007, up over 40 percentage points from debt loads of 90% prevailing just a decade earlier. And now it is finally over. The U.S. consumption binge was fodder to export-led economies elsewhere in the world. That was especially the case in developing Asia. I believe that this first phase is about 65% complete, more behind us than ahead of us, but still a good deal more to come as the business cycle now kicks in and produces yet another round of earnings impairment for financial intermediaries. The second stage reflects the impacts of the credit and housing implosions on the real side of the U.S. economy. As noted above, the main event in this phase of the adjustment is the likely capitulation of the overextended, saving short, overly indebted U.S. consumer. The third stage is a global phase, underscored by the linkages between the U.S. consumer and the rest of the world. In short, this macro crisis is far from over. The main reason that the bubbles that have burst, property and credit, became so big, they ended up infecting the real side of the U.S. economy. The global economy is facing a multi-year rebalancing as it now reins in its appetite for unsustainable hypergrowth. Again, Kevin, it's interesting to see the chorus begin to hit its high notes and there to be real confluence, whether it's an economist at New York University, whether it's Alan Greenspan, whether it's Stephen Roach, head of Asian operations for Morgan Stanley, or the senior banking official at the Bank of Japan.
This brings us to what we've been talking about the last several weeks. The problem is the